This episode is brought to you by the Sasquatch Flag Company. The Sasquatch Flag Company is a family-owned business in New England that builds hand-carved American flags from seasoned white pine. Each flag is hand-built and each star on the flag is hand-hammered and chiseled. No two flags are alike. They offer a variety of flag designs to honor the police, military, firefighters, dispatchers, and search and rescue personnel, to name a few. These stunning handmade flags look great in an office, a studio, the back porch, or above the fireplace mantle. They make the perfect gift for the veteran, first responder, or patriot in your life. Now, I love these flags, and I've been giving them as gifts for years, and I was a customer long before they became a sponsor of the show. I can't recommend them enough. So if you're looking for that perfect, uniquely American-made gift to give away, or if you want to treat yourself, go to sasquatchflags.com and get your order in today. Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Mark Carpenter. Mark is a serial storyteller, telling stories since childhood. Mark leveraged his ability in a career in marketing communications and public relations, and later as a college professor and corporate facilitator. His storytelling became even more purposeful and effective after researching and writing the best-selling book, Master Storytelling: How to Turn Your Experiences into Stories That Teach, Lead, and Inspire. Now, as a facilitator, consultant, and speaker, he teaches others what he learned in this process. And I'm excited to have him on the show to talk about the importance of storytelling in leadership. So, Mark, welcome to the show.
John, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
I am honored to have you on the show, and I'm excited to talk about the subject of storytelling. We've touched on it in the past, but it's been a while since we talked about storytelling, and you are the master storyteller, so I'm excited to have you on the show. But I want you to just start a little bit. We in the intro, we talked about you storytelling being a part of your life for a long time. Tell us about yourself and your history with storytelling and where it's led you in your life.
Wow. How long do we have is where that one goes. I'll actually go back a little bit to childhood. I grew up with my mother, who was a reading teacher. So we always had books. And so stories were just always part of how I consumed the world. And I also realized that storytelling was a way for me to kind of make people laugh and get their attention and make friends with them. But that was, as a kid, you don't realize how purposeful that can be as an adult. And so moving into business, I started realizing, wow, storytelling really connects people to principles and points. And then I helped a friend of mine write a book. And afterward, I said to my wife, gosh, I feel like I should write my own book, but I don't know what it is. And as those that are near and dear to us can do, she looked at me and said, oh, I know. And at first I was startled. I was like, well, how can you know if I don't know? She said, no, you've got to write a book about how you just take everyday experiences and turn them into stories that teach important principles. And my first reaction was, it's not a book. That's just what people do.
Right.
And she said, no, you do it because you've always done it.
Yeah.
But there's a way that you do it that you need to teach other people. So I started asking other people about that process or about that thought. And they said, yeah, I'd love to read a book like that. And that just kind of got me into it. And I synced up with my good friend, Daryl Harmon, and he and I co-authored this book back at the end of 2018. And it's interesting as part of the research for the book to find out that what I was doing fairly natural has some really solid background to it that I wasn't aware of. So now, as you said in the introduction, I can be more deliberate and more conscious about how I turn those everyday experiences into these stories that teach, lead, sell, and inspire.
Okay, well, I'm excited to get into it because I do believe in the power of stories. And if anyone's read my book, the people are listening in, hopefully you've read my books, you'll know I love telling stories. So hopefully I'm getting some things right in my stories, but we'll find out in talking with you. But so this book is called Master Storytelling. Who was the audience when you wrote the book? Who were you thinking that was going to read it? And who really needs to know about storytelling?
When we first started writing the book and we asked ourselves that question, who's our audience? Who is this? Our first thought was, well, everyone needs this. Everyone needs the power of storytelling. But if you write a book for everyone, you write it for no one.
Right.
And so really we honed in on a couple of audiences. And I might even have adjusted that a little bit more knowing what I know now. But one of our first audiences was leaders. We want leaders to not just give information, but tell the story of what that information means and how that connects to people. Now, a part of my backing on that is I remember the time that I had a new leader come into an organization, new CEO, and I was consulting with him on the first company-wide meeting that he was going to lead. And he said, well, I want to share with everybody all the details of EBITDA. And if somebody
Yes.
doesn't know what EBITDA, that's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation,
Right.
amortization. And I said, oh, okay, give me a little more on that. He said, well, I want this chart and this chart and this chart and this chart. And I said, okay, we're working in a software company here with a lot of software engineers. They need to know what that means to them. And he said, they need to figure it out. I
Oh,
was like, oh,
wow.
please, 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 please give them some context around this. And he didn't. Now, I'm just going to ask you, John, what do you think happened with that audience during his first
Yeah.
presentation to the entire
He
company?
didn't connect. It didn't resonate. So it was one of these blah, blah, blah meetings. And you go back to work. You're like that. Well, that was interesting. And you go back to work, Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't
Yeah.
impact
And
him.
so it
Yeah.
was kind of like, I think of it as how the teacher sounds on all the Charlie Brown
That's
cartoons.
it. That's it.
You remember that, where it's just kind of like, wah, 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 wah,
Right.
wah, wah, wah.
Right.
That's really what they were hearing, because they didn't know how to connect to it.
Mm.
So leaders was one of our key audiences, to get them past that, to get them to say, what does this really mean to the people that you need to connect with if you're really going to lead effectively? Another audience that we were focused on was people who do training and facilitation.
Mm.
Daryl and I both have a background in training and facilitation. And that's a great place, as you're teaching, that storytelling is very powerful
Mm.
to help get new concepts across to people. Now, the third audience that we had some emphasis on, we'd probably ratchet up a little bit more if we knew then what we know now, and that's sales professionals,
Mm.
people in sales and in sales leadership, because sales is such a great place to include story. Sales professionals so often get caught up in features and benefits and facts and figures
Yes.
and the why we're so important and pricing and all that stuff. Those things are important, but they need to, the customer, the potential customer, needs to know, what does that mean to me?
Mm.
How does that affect me? Not just here's the benefits, but how do those benefits apply to me? And that comes across best in a story.
Mm.
And you think about who people buy from. They buy from people they know, trust, and like. Well, storytelling is a great way to get people to know you and trust you and like you. And so we see sales as one of our key audiences as well.
Interesting. Yeah, I noticed on your website, because in the book you say teach, lead, and inspire, but I think on the website you say teach, lead, sell, and inspire. So I think
Yeah.
from what it sounds like, you found that sales is another perfect place for this to exist as well. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a bigger audience than we thought it would be for storytelling. But as we've
Yeah.
gotten into it, that's been one of our key audiences.
Yeah. I like that idea. The idea that connecting human to human, that's how you're going to sell. You're not going to sell with features and benefits and pricing. Yeah, absolutely. So, so the obvious question, why do people love stories? Why is storytelling so effective?
Well, we love stories because we live stories.
Hmm.
This is our lives are just little pieces of stories that we go through. It's
Right.
just little chunks of experience that we have. Those are the stories along the way. And that's how we connect as a species, is through these stories. You think about other animals. I don't know why I was thinking about this the other day, but if you go to the dog park and two dogs meet each other, well, how do they get to know each other and trust each other?
It's
They
smell. Yeah.
sniff each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope we're a little more evolved than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But and so in our species, we don't do that so much with our bodies, but we connect through our minds, and
Hmm.
it's our shared experiences. I mean, John, before you and I started the recording here, we had a little conversation. And what do we start connecting to? Well, where do you live? Oh, I have a sister that lives in that area. And
Yeah.
oh
Yeah.
yeah, I've been to your area. And what do you do? Oh yeah, I've had some experience doing that too. We talked about skiing as something that we've both decided is probably not a good activity for us in our stages of life.
Right.
And those kinds of things connect us as a species, because it helps us to see, this person's part of my tribe. They're
Hmm.
like me. We have
Yeah.
these similarities. And so stories connect us as a species. There's a ton of brain science around this that shows that this is what connects us as human beings.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I think, you were talking about your CEO, and I, I've been leading plants for so long that I'm spending a lot of time in front of blue collar workers, right? And I've always said, like, I've got to relate stories that they're going to get and understand. And so to me, it's just sort of natural. Like, how do I connect with this audience? Well, the best way is to tell a story or an experience. And I see so many of my peers would, just like your CEO, want to go up there and talk about the latest KPIs or what have you, and they don't. And I think they're missing out on that human to human connection. Like, do I talk about KPIs? Yes, but I'll do it in a story versus in a, like, here's the facts and figures. I'll relate that to why it's important and why it matters to them. And I think that's, and like you said, it's part of how we connect as humans, is we connect through stories. So to me, I've always found it as valuable, or at least if you can thread the importance of why why EBITDA is important, if you thread that into a story, they're more likely to remember it and more likely to relate to it.
Right on. You're exactly there. And I'm so glad that you said, do I talk about KPIs? Absolutely. Because that's one of the pushbacks I get sometimes from leaders. Well, you can't expect me not to talk about goals and KPIs and EBITDA and on all these other things that are important to the business. Yes, do talk about them, but give some structure and some context around them. Sometimes leaders feel like, well, that's going to make me a soft leader or a light leader if I'm telling stories. But the reality is it's the opposite. By making you a human leader, people will connect with you more and follow you more. There's this great research study that was done, and I'm not going to get the researchers' names right off the top of my head, but it's in a book called Influencer. And they talked about how there's three groups of people that these researchers got together. And one group, they gave them the information verbally, and that was it. And the second group, they gave them the information verbally with charts and graphs. And the third group of people, they gave them the information in the form or in the context of a story. And then they brought them back together about 2 weeks later to see how much they remembered and how accurately they remembered and what the impact was of the information on them, kind of broadly. They were mainly looking at the memory part of it. They found, the thing that was interesting to me is those first two groups, there was no statistical difference in how much they remembered or how accurately they remembered. So the charts and graphs that we think are so wonderful didn't really make that much difference. But the group that heard it in the story, they remembered more information, they remembered it more accurately, and the important part to me was they found it more credible. Think about that as a leader.
Yeah.
If you're talking about KPIs, if you're talking about EBITDA, if you're talking about whatever kind of information that you're sharing, and you want people to remember it, understand it, and find it credible, story is a very powerful way to do that. And it's more powerful than just giving the information, and even more powerful than just sharing charts and graphs.
I love it. I love it. I was just going to say one example maybe that I did when I was leading my last plant is we were having scrap problems. And I would tell people, here's how we did this month in scrap. But instead of giving a number, I would find a brand new car. And I said, this is the car we could have bought if we had not had this much scrap. And it was just, and so at one point we had a house up there. This is when we first started. I was like, we could have bought this house this month. This is how much we threw out. And the employees were like, it's like they relate to it. Like, that's a lot of money versus a number on a chart. They, it was just like, here's this house. We could have bought this house just this month. And you could see people like talking to each other and whispering to each other. It was like they related to that, versus a chart or or a graph or what have you. Yeah.
That's a wonderful example, John, because, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Yeah.
But when you put that picture or let people develop the picture in their heads, when it's their own picture, that's probably worth 10,000 words.
Yeah.
So you showed that house and they're picturing themselves in that house or with that house and thinking, oh my, that's a lot. That's where it really starts connecting, when you bring that story in and let them build that picture in their head of how that connects to them.
Yeah.
It is a very powerful connection into their memory system.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I love it. I love how and that the research backs up that idea of making stories that relate, and they're more likely to remember it for sure. So what are I was thinking of mistakes. So what are the three biggest mistakes that we make when we're telling stories from your book and from your research?
I think the three biggest mistakes come back to one big mistake. And it really is being intentional about the story. A lot of times people say, well, I have this story, I'll tell this story, stories are important, so let me tell this story. But they don't have a real clear intent on why they're telling that story. And so that's the overarching mistake that leads to two other mistakes. And those mistakes are they rush through it and they get to the end and people are like, I don't know what you're even talking about here. They don't paint that picture that we were just talking about.
Yeah.
So people don't have a good, clear picture in their heads about what's the purpose of this. And so it doesn't connect to them. The second potential problem is what I call they don't land the plane. They start off on this story and maybe they know there's an end down there somewhere, but in search of that, they wander around in the story with every single detail that could possibly be told, hoping that eventually they find the place to land that plane.
Yeah.
And you lose people in the process of doing that.
Yes.
So the best way to overcome either of those problems is to be really intentional about what is the purpose that I want to get to at the end of this story. Because in doing that, you'll help edit yourself on what needs to be in, what needs to be out to help actually make the point of that story.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the things I had a coach when I wrote my first book, and he talked about storytellers build tension. So it's like a rubber band. You pull this tension, right? And so the audience is leaning in like, whoa, what is happening here? Right. And you maybe give it up a little bit, then you pull it tighter again. But you at the end of the day, you got to release that tension. Otherwise, your audience goes, well, what was that all about? Well, how did it end? I remember my wife read one of the stories in my first book, and she's like, I love this story. What happened next? Like, because I told a story of a leader who backed me up in a problem. And she's like, well, that's great, but what happened next? And I was like, oh, we ended up like getting record sales. We were the first to the market with this product. And she's like, tell that part. That's what I want to know. That's the release of the tension, and so it's landing the plane, like you said, it's releasing that tension where your audience goes, wow, that's so you're right. I think we forget that we tell a great story and it's like, but the plane's still in the air, the tension's still on, and the audience is like, what happened? Yeah, I love that.
Years ago, I was facilitating a class and I told the beginning of a story at one point because it was making a point about the problem.
Yeah.
And then I usually told the end of the story when we got to the solution to that problem, which was an hour and a half or so down the road.
Oh, yeah.
So I told the beginning of the story and I set it up and they could see the problem. And then we got behind. Something happened that we got really behind on time. And I forgot to tell the end of the story.
Oh, yeah.
And at the end of the class, somebody comes up to me and says, you have got to tell me the end of that story before
That's
I
where our
leave here.
brains
It's driving me crazy.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I felt so bad that I hadn't closed that loop for them.
Yeah.
Because you're right. If you leave that tension there, you're leaving an open loop in their brain.
Yes.
And their brain's constantly going, what happened? Why is this? What's there? How can I get to the end of this? The resolution in there. Because when you come to the resolution in that story, the listener actually gets an increase of dopamine in their brain.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
And that's that kind of feeling, that relief that you get. You get dopamine when you level up in a video game.
Yeah.
Or even when you check something off your to-do list, there's a little spike of dopamine because it's a sense of accomplishment and completion.
Yeah.
You get that at the end of the story. And without that, people are left with the tension or the cortisol that's making them go, what's happening? What's happening? What's happening? You got to get them to that satisfactory ending.
Oh, man, I love it. I love it. I love that the science backs up this way that we act and think as humans. Well, one of the things I was thinking about you're telling this is that, for me, like I'm writing a book about stories. I'm writing stories in my book, but I've done some pretty amazing things, right? So it's easy for me to like, oh, I've got a story about this because this happened in my life, right? But where do people go if maybe they feel like they live a fairly ordinary life? Where can they find stories in their ordinary life to be able to tell to make a point in these when they're getting a chance to present or they're writing or what have you?
Well, I always tell people that the extraordinary lives inside the ordinary. Some of the greatest stories that you hear are about ordinary things that happen. And they're great stories because you can relate to them. You can make a connection to them. I actually had somebody in one of my workshops years ago who, when we were talking about telling stories that make a point, and I said, where do you come up with stories? Where do you come up with experiences you can turn into stories? very enthusiastically, this participant said, "Oh, I make them up." And I
Well,
said,
there you go.
what do you mean you make them up? She says, "Oh, I make up stories about this crazy Uncle Ned that doesn't exist." And I'm listening to her going, "Oh, how am I going to make this a safe environment and still tell her I think that's a bad idea?" And somebody else in the workshop spoke up and said, "I'm not sure that's going to come across as authentic." And so we had a conversation about that. Oh, this poor participant, she was like, "Well, then where am I going to find a story for this segment that I've got to teach tomorrow?" And she was panicked about it. And so I talked to her about just looking for experiences in her life. One of the things that I encourage people to look for is look for those times that you have an emotional reaction to something.
Mm.
If you have an emotional reaction, there's probably some lesson embedded inside of that experience that can be a story to teach a principle. You may not know what the principle is at that point, but note those things that you have an emotional reaction to, because they're probably a good story that you could use at some point. Well, I want to finish the story about this participant in that workshop, because she came back the next day and taught her segment, which needed to include her telling a story. And she told this great story about something that happened to her on the elevator in the hotel the night before.
Mm.
And I said to her, "Where did you come up with that? How did you that was a real story, wasn't it?" She said, "Oh, yes, it was." I said, "How did you come up with that experience as your story?" She said, "I was in my hotel room stressing about doing this, stressing about where I was going to come up with a story, and I just needed a mental break. So I got on the elevator to go downstairs and just take a walk around the hotel. On the elevator, I had this experience where this lady had this weird reaction to something that I did. The elevator had done one of those little jolt things as it stopped, and the other person in the elevator had a big luggage cart, and the luggage fell off the cart. Well, my friend that was in the elevator with her laughed, but nervously, about the elevator falling. Well, this other person thought, "Oh, she's laughing at me." And
Oh,
so when she
yeah.
piled her luggage back on the cart as she walked out, she turns around and says, "Glad you thought that was funny." And so my friend walked out going, "That was just a weird reaction about that." And she started walking around and she was thinking about that reaction. She went, "That actually fits with what I need to teach tomorrow."
Oh, yes.
And it was there for her. So that's the other way to look for experiences that are going to turn into great stories. What do you need to tell a story about? What's a principle you need to teach? And then start looking for it. And it's really weird. The universe will send it to you.
Yeah.
If you're looking for those experiences to teach a certain principle, you'll find them. The other thing is ask other people. Ask other
Yeah.
people the experiences that they've had that might fit to a certain principle. So there's the two ways that I have to look at it. One, if you have a topic you need a story around, start looking for it and ask about it.
Mm.
Two, look for those experiences in your life where you have an emotional reaction, because there's likely a lesson embedded in that experience.
I love that you say that, because I was listening. I love comedy, and I love the process by which comedians create material. And I heard a couple of comedians on a podcast talking about they said that exact thing, same thing. They keep a notebook, and when they do have an emotional reaction to something, and something hits them emotionally, they write it down, because there's usually a funny something, some sort of a funny thing in there that they want to be able to capture. So, and you think about like the Seinfeld humor. It's like observations on daily life that are funny, but they're funny because of the emotions that are involved in these basic things, like a luggage falling off a cart and somebody's reaction to it, driving down the street, or waiting in line at a supermarket. There's all these things that happen to us which we can use to relate to other people who have been in an exact same scenario before and have probably had a similar emotional reaction.
Right on. I go back to something I said a little earlier. We love stories because we live stories.
Yeah.
We can relate to that. And you think of the great comics that are out there. They're talking about these everyday experiences that then they exaggerate a little bit,
Yeah.
and they deliver it in an excellent way that's very well practiced for them. But they're very ordinary experiences that we can relate to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what makes the connection for us.
Hmm. So how can people that may not be natural storytellers, how can they develop a skill like this? So how does your CEO, the EBITDA CEO, how do they develop a skill to be a storyteller?
I hear this one a lot too. I'm not a natural storyteller. I just can't do this because I'm not natural at it. I'm going to put this back to you, John. What is something that you're really good at now that 10 years ago you weren't good at?
Podcasting.
Okay, that's one that very often comes up in this.
Right.
The first time you hosted a podcast, were you a great podcast host?
I was terrible. Some would argue I'm still learning.
No, I'd say you're pretty good. How did you get better?
It's reps, just continuing to do it, and then finding what I tell people. I had to find my radio voice. I had to find my voice, and I had, as an author, I had to find my voice as an author. You know, I took writing and writing and writing. Then you find your voice eventually, and that's who you are. But it takes just reps. You know, time under pressure until you finally like, okay, well, this is just normal for me now.
And now, John, you have just answered your own question. That's exactly how you get better at storytelling. Yeah. It's the reps. You've got to do it, learn about it, learn the structure, possibly even get some coaching, but then it's reps. It's practicing it. It's doing it over and over again. It's not always going to be natural for you, but it's the reps over the time where you start getting the feedback. And some of the best feedback you can get is looking in the eyes of the people you're telling the story to and seeing how they react to it. That kind of repetition and that kind of feedback loop that you can get into, say, ooh, that landed, that didn't. That's what's going to help you become a better storyteller. But you never get better at it just by thinking about it. You actually have to do it. But it's the practice, like any other skill. You build that skill by working on it.
Interesting. And I think, I would imagine too, if you have a mind to start, say, like, I want to be a better storyteller, is being more observant towards stories that you hear in your day-to-day life and say, wow, that one hit. Why did that hit? What about that story was memorable to me? You know, as being an observer of stories, I would say. Would that help as well? Like starting to see what works in your life, what hits home with you, and you're like, okay, I like that. I want to incorporate some of those kind of elements in the way I tell stories. Is that something as well?
Absolutely. Learn from the best. Listen to those stories that you have a reaction to and say, okay, why? Break it down. What was the structure in that story that really drew me into it? What did they do? What did they not do that actually drew me into the story that made that impactful for me? And I'll go back to something else I talked about before, which is the intentionality. And it's really being intentional about, what am I trying to convey with this story? What is the reaction that I want as I teach, lead, sell, and inspire? What do I want people to do with this? And look for people that have told stories that help lead you along that same kind of path and start patterning after them. But again, even just listening to them is not going to help you until you start getting it out of your mouth.
Yeah. I always say that, you know, if you want to learn how to play guitar, you have to play guitar. You can't read a book. You can't listen to guitar. You have to play a guitar to learn how to play guitar. It's same thing with leadership. To be a good leader, you have to lead people. It's the only way to do it. So, yeah, excellent.
And recognize that you're going to make mistakes, but learn from those mistakes.
Yeah.
Turn those bad days into good data. That you say, okay, I made this mistake. What was the mistake I made there? Okay, I'll learn from that for next time. And that applies for storytelling. It applies for leadership. It applies for the other things that we do in our lives.
I love it. So why would you, you know, just, we talked about storytelling. Why would you say that storytelling is essential for leadership today?
I hinted at this, I think, a little bit before. Storytelling is the way we connect as human beings. We connect as a species through stories. As a leader, you want people to follow you. That is your role as a leader. And connecting with them is one of the best ways to do that. Storytelling will humanize you as a leader. Sometimes leaders say, "Ooh, that scares me a little bit. I don't want to be the human leader. I want to be the strong leader." But you actually come across as a stronger leader by being more human. And that's where people are going to know, trust, and like you, and they'll follow you more when they can trust you like that. Storytelling builds trust between the storyteller and the listener. And when you're a leader, you want people to trust you. That's why when they'll follow you is when they trust you. And so I think that's one of the powerful things about storytelling. It brings that humanity back into leadership. So we're leading people like people. And that's going to be strong leadership that we really need in business today.
I can't add anything to that. Absolutely agree with you 100%. That's fantastic. So what message would you like to leave? We got a lot of leaders listening in to this show. What final message would you like to leave with the leaders who are listening in about the subject of storytelling?
Really, it's two things, and they're connected. The first I'd like to say is your story does matter. I'll go back to something you said earlier. Oh, nothing interesting happens to me. I don't really have any stories to tell. That's just false. Okay. Your story matters. You have experiences, you have a story to tell, and it matters. And then it connects to that last point that I was making too, that when you tell your story, you become a better leader because you're a more human leader.
Mm.
And when you do that, it will strengthen your leadership capacity, and you will teach people a lot of things about leadership as you use storytelling as a key leadership skill.
Absolutely. Well, that's been fantastic. Mark, how can people find out more about you in this book?
First place to go would be our website, which is master-storytelling.com. So you got to get that little dash between master and storytelling to be able to find us. You can also find us on LinkedIn and Facebook. I welcome people to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. So look for Mark Carpenter that has master storytelling in his background there on the page. I think if you look for my name and master storytelling, I'm the first one that comes up on LinkedIn. And I would just like to offer to your listeners a free copy of our ebook of master storytelling. We've got a page set up, a hidden page on our website for podcast listeners. If you go to master-storytelling.com/podcast gift, and just for the high price of your name and your email address, I'll give you a copy of the ebook of master storytelling, and that'll be a way to start on that journey as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, you just heard that here. You get a free book if you go to this link, and we'll put the link in the show notes for that resource. Not often you get something free these days, so you get a free ebook if you go to this the website that we'll have in the link below, and get a copy of this great book. The book is called Master Storytelling, and again, this is a very important issue for leaders. Connecting with people. I talk about in this podcast, leadership is a people business. We have to connect with our people. One of the ways we connect is with storytelling. Mark has given us a lot of things to think about with respect to storytelling. So I encourage you to check out his resources, check out the book that we have the link below, and learn more about storytelling. Be a more effective leader through great storytelling. Mark, I want to thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for sharing this all the data and the research and your experience in the subject. I think it's helped us kind of take another step towards being better storytellers. So I appreciate you coming on the show, and I really appreciate you sharing all this information.
John, it's been my pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for giving me time and access to your guests, and I hope that I've added value to them.
Absolutely. This has been a great conversation. I know it's going to be valuable to our listeners as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.